Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this video is a precursor to Chapter 4, and Chapter 4 is called Continental Empires. So, just like the name implies, this chapter, this section of the book, taking place in the mid 1600s and up to 1700, is all about how the changes in empire and the battles between France and England and Spain all have an effect on the colonies. So that's what this chapter is all about. And one of the things I want to talk about briefly again, I mentioned it last time, was this notion of mercantilism because it's really different than what we experience in our country right now. In other words, during this period of time, nations getting wealthy was important. It was part of the central economic plan. Whereas now, it's here it's corporations can do whatever they want. So you hear a lot about corporations holding their money outside of the U.S. and you'll hear politicians talk about how unfair that is or how corporations are outsourcing jobs. That's not strengthening our national economy at all. So it's really the opposite of this mercantilism type economic plan that was underway with England, especially in the 1600s and the late 1600s. So there's that part of it. The other thing is that understand that England and the new colonies of Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay that we talked about in the last chapter, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, the beginnings of Connecticut, the beginnings of New York, the beginnings of Virginia, these were not really connected and they weren't really ruled that strongly by England. England really didn't have a master economic plan for the colonies. So things became somewhat independent amongst those colonies with a relatively loose control as far as the British government was concerned. So one of the things you're going to read about is the formation of these colonies. The ones I mentioned, of course, Connecticut, Rhode Island, you already read about, Massachusetts, Virginia for sure. And one of the other things that's interesting that I want to stress is as these colonies formed, you started to see constitutions being written or charters being written, but constitutions being written for individual colonies, and that's important as we get into the Constitution in the late 1700s because the basis for a lot of these colonial constitutions or these early constitutions for these different colonies, especially Massachusetts and some of the ideas that came out of South Carolina, really go into the philosophical backings of the U.S. Constitution. And one thing in particular is this notion of liberalism. So liberalism really not the same definition we use today as far as liberals are concerned. Liberalism, as far as political thought is concerned, really came about because of a guy named John Locke in the late 1600s. And Locke was a Scottish philosopher, but he lived in South Carolina, so he was active in the South Carolinian government and really was influential as far as this notion of liberalism is concerned. So I just want to bring that up. Again, South Carolina was where Locke was at, and Locke was pro-slavery. So again, the notion of liberty and civil rights, which he espoused, he didn't believe that all people were equal in that sense. But Locke's really important because he wrote something called the Two Treatises of Government in 1690, and it's really the foundation of liberalism. It talks about civil rights. So this idea that people have natural rights is something that is passed down into our Constitution, and John Locke was one of the original theorists who came up with a lot of these ideas and wrote about these ideas, and he was very influential. So this notion of liberalism, natural rights, and liberty, if you will, starts to become a thread that's running through the colonies and the government of the colonies, and Locke's original proposals for the Constitution in South Carolina weren't approved by the king in England because they were seen as too liberal. So I just want to throw that out there because we're going to get into talking about the Constitution in the next couple of weeks. And all of these ideas about liberty and freedom and rights and civil rights, they all originate from somewhere, and John Locke's writings are very influential. So if you want to read more about John Locke, I encourage you to do so. Fascinating guy. I mean, there's a lot of juxtaposition between his feelings about slavery and his feelings about liberty in general. But his writings are good, and his philosophy is really important to the formation of our Constitution. The other thing you're going to read about on page 106 is the rights of an Englishman. This is something that many of the colonists thought they should have, but again, Parliament and the King back in England didn't believe in it, and one of the reasons that's important because included in this notion of the rights of an Englishman is a section about taxation. In other words, if you're operating under Englishman rights, taxation should be a local thing and not a distant thing. And when we get into the idea of taxation without representation in the next 150 years here, that idea of the rights of the Englishman and those rights being denied to colonists will become part of the revolutionary thread that's running through the rebels in the colony. So there's that part. The other thing that's interesting, read about witchcraft on page 108. That's an interesting section of the text as well, because witchcraft all revolves around this notion of magic. And one of the things that's important to realize is that when we as people don't understand natural phenomenon, often we say it's magic when we can't explain what's going on. So in the 1600s, before people knew about germs and people knew about where diseases came from and they couldn't explain natural occurrences, often they would attribute these things to witches or to magic. So it's interesting to read about that. And then finally, as you finish this chapter, you're going to read about what's going on with the French, what's going on with the Spanish, and especially throughout this whole chapter, the French and the English are fighting all the time. They're having wars for dominance all the time. So the fighting between the Anglos and the French results in changes in the colonies and power grabs in the colonies. So that in turn displaces the Indians, and Native Americans kind of always lose throughout this chapter. And so when we talk about how the battles between empires, even over in Europe, can have an effect in the colonies, you start to understand it's all a power grab. So that's the summary of chapter 4. It's a good chapter, and it's an important chapter. Probably the most important thing for me to take out of this is learning about John Locke and this notion of liberalism, because that's going to be an important philosophy that's going to come back into play when we talk about the basis for our Constitution in the late 1700s. So that's it for now. Have a great week. I hope you're all having a great semester. Be safe, and I'll talk to you again next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.